Welcome everyone to the next episode of the Send Nutrition Podcast. You're with your host Bryan and Peter today, and spring has sprung in episode 53, Peter.
That was good, Bryan. Did you save that one up for a while?
Oh, I had it in my head. And today we're going to talk about spring pasture and what this presents in terms of challenges to horse owners that have those lush paddocks. And we're going to go through the common conditions that can develop from this lush spring pasture and give some ways to help prevent or limit the effects of this. And these conditions include spookiness and aggression, weight loss, colic, and laminitis is another one. So how are you, Peter?
Bryan, not too bad today. It is getting obviously warm, so it's a good time to address this topic about spring pasture. And we've had a few clients of ours and even new potential clients that have sort of emailed or called through about their horses sort of ballooning out in weights, having a few different symptoms that the horses haven't had sort of during the winter time. So it's probably good that we address what might be contributing to these issues, these problems, and just sort of try to knock it on the head for our clients and listeners.
Yeah, with some horses, it can be a pretty dangerous time in terms of their metabolic condition that they're in, and that prone to laminitis especially. And as the pastures grow through the spring season, they need to be really closely managed, and we will go through this.
Bryan, I think it's pretty important that we sort of just explain to our listeners out there how the hay that their listeners might be feeding in the wintertime obviously changes pretty drastically to when you've got this abundant lush pasture. So I think what causes a lot of these problems is the sudden change in diet, and you might think, well, sudden change in diet, but if you're on a pasture only diet or you're on a hay only diet and your horse is getting 2 to 3% of its body weight through hay, and now you're going to tip it out into lush pasture, that pasture is a lot different in terms of the calories, the nutrients, vitamins, minerals to what your hay has. So it's important to know that you can't just be on a hay only diet and just throw the horse into the paddock and expect nothing to happen.
Yeah, totally right, Peter. It's a totally different nutrient profile for one. The microbiome has to adjust, and that takes time. And it is just like changing feeds, and you have to manage your horse correctly through this time. And the inquiries we have, all the questions that come through, is some horse owners will look at what they're feeding and what they're adding to their feed for the cause of the symptom or the condition, where looking at the environment of the paddock is probably the first part that they should be looking at and zeroing in, or taking the time to understand what is going on nutrition-wise in that paddock pasture.
Yeah, Bryan, that's well said. And like you said, you look at the overall environment in terms of what you're feeding, what's changed, and if something has changed, obviously has that caused the problem. So just to get stuck into it, we had a phone call. It was from a potential client, and she said that a horse around about this time every year sort of starts head shaking, and you'll go into obviously the potassium and the magnesium and the science behind that. But the first thing I sort of said to her was, is it happen every year around about the same time, or is it throughout the whole year? And she said, look, it just happens this time of the year. So it's important that you look at, okay, well, that spring pasture that's popped up, there's a lot of sugar in it. It could have a lot of potassium. So you might want to get that pasture analysed just to know exactly what potentially could be causing the problem, and then try to balance your diet around the actual pasture itself. So we'll give a few tips of how to transition onto spring pasture and sort of what to do and not what to do as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good kickoff point, Peter, in terms of one of the conditions that they see a horse spooky or a different aggression or different behaviour, looking at that spring pasture and seeing why it is affecting them. And the obvious one is the sugar or that insulin response and affecting that whole behaviour pattern. But also the other one, not commonly looked at, is that lush pasture. It does contain high levels of potassium as it is growing, and low levels of magnesium. And this has not been proven in horses, but in other animal species, including humans. So we can derive a lot of research. They're all mammals. And what we do is you've got excessive potassium, and this can reduce the absorption of magnesium in a nutshell. And the reason for this is that magnesium is responsible for the body to cope with stress and is really needed in levels. But if you're excreting more, you've got low levels in the diet due to this spring pasture, then you're going to see all these classic signs of that spookiness, but also other things like twitching and bit of incoordination and muscle tenseness. So looking at the overall picture of the horse and seeing that response, you can sort of zero down on that growing pasture or that fresh spring pasture as the cause.
Well, in summary, Brian, it's from what you're trying to say, it's very easy to overload a few different elements, say whether it's, it's the minerals, because that pasture obviously is very rich. And then you got to look at, well, what else are you feeding on top of that pasture, and try to balance out that you're not overdoing one thing and you're not underdoing another.
Yeah. It's a fine line, and we will go into strategies to help overcome this. Another aspect of spring pasture is something that's very interesting in terms of the dry matter fed. So lush spring pasture can be so heavy with water content and low in dry matter. So what conditions in a horse can this cause? And it's weight loss, diarrhea, or colic. So looking at this, if the horse is grazing all day but getting a low percentage of dry matter and only getting water in that, and an extremely high amount of water with the amount of pasture grazed, they're not ingesting enough dry matter to maintain their weight or keep that digestive flow happening to help prevent colic or other metabolic problems from occurring. So this is quite fascinating that you need that fiber present where it is not present in that early growth. And zeroing down on this, having a high risk of colic in horses during these seasons is a must with these horse owners.
Yeah, that's extremely well summarised. And look, some of the people out there might be, say, switching to another feed just as the spring grass is about to sort of, pop up, and, they have some sort of, reaction, and, automatically it's, oh, well, I've changed this feed. This is the problem that's happened, but they don't look into the spring grass that's obviously at its richest throughout the year. So, don't go out there just sort of blaming the thing that you've changed or what's different. Look at the overall balance. And that's where we offer a free diet analysis. Carly's obviously is extremely good and very quick turnaround time. So it's probably more paramount to do the free diet analysis right now, because there is a lot changing and you want to knock that on the head sort of before it gets into a bigger problem.
Yeah, that's well said, Peter. And another aspect of all this is even protein levels in that early vegetative stage of the spring grass. It can be quite high, and you won't know that unless you get that tested, and we'll go through that later. But it can present a problem where people put their horse out on this lush grass, high protein content, but then they stall them or stable them overnight, and when they excrete this protein, it's ammonia in the form of ammonia, and this can really pose a problem in the respiratory irritation of a horse if the area is not ventilated or cleaned out properly. So day after day, if they're breathing in that ammonia, it can really present that problem. So yeah, it's kind of a vicious cycle that the horse owner is creating by getting this high protein from the lush grass and exposing that ammonia level through the urine for that horse on a daily basis through spring.
That's well summarised, Brian. And look, as an example, Brian, let's just say that horse is on a hay-only diet in a winter time, and hay might be 8 to 10% if it's a pasture hay and protein. And I'm seeing sort of research that we've come across with spring grass sort of being 20 to 20, sort of 24%, which is double. So now, that horse is getting double the protein. You might have been feeding a bit of lucerne for a bit extra protein, obviously, during the winter, and you're still feeding that lucerne on top of the 20% pasture, and that horse isn't doing anything. It's just, it's just roaming the paddocks. That's way too much protein. And now it gets stalled, as you said. That ammonia obviously is pretty intense, and dehydration start occurring. You've got kidney issues going on there as well eventually, sort of if that diet is implemented long term. So you really got to look at not just the diet, but also the calories obviously that are coming in, but also the work that the horse is doing. So it's like us eating McDonald's and KFC every day, not working out or not going, for a walk, just sitting in front of the TV. I mean, we're going to pack on the pound. So it's all calories in, calories out.
Yeah, that's well said, Peter. Including that NSC content of this green pasture can be so high in terms of affect a horse's insulin levels, which can lead the horse to be prone to laminitis when grazing these pastures that accumulate the high NSC. And putting this with high potassium and reduced magnesium, it's going to really prolong the elevations of insulin, and this really poses big problems to the horse going forward.
Yep. And also, Brian, for some of our listeners out there, they might not sort of realise this, but a lot of the horses sort of get a real gleam and bloom to their coats during spring grass, and that's because of the omega-3. The essential fats, obviously, in that are at its highest in that time. So in the wintertime, obviously, they're at their lowest, and that's where a product like the Sentinel comes in just to fill in that deficiency that the hay has. So with 60% omega-3, we fix that gap. You might not be reaching out for the Sentinel as much, obviously, during spring pasture, but unless you get your pasture tested, it's hard to know what the omega-3 is in it.
Yeah, and having your whole diet looked at and balanced, you may need a reduced amount, you might need to stay on that maintenance amount. It just depends on your horse's workload and what their needs are in the end, or aims in competition.
Yeah, correct.
So I think, Peter, we can go through some management techniques to help reduce the negative impact of the fresh spring pasture and also your horse's health in general. So I think the first thing is, if you identify your pasture, it's probably testing would be your first line of defense in terms of knowing where you stand nutrition-wise, and then assessing this to see if you need to change to a hay or a more consistent nutrient profile due to the variables around your pasture in the paddock.
Yeah, that's 100%. And look, and I'm sure some of the people out there sort of don't have access to get the pasture tested. So a tip might be is to continue off a hay, even if the grass is growing well. The new grass contains a lot of water and little fiber, as sort of Brian mentioned. So the extra fiber in the hay that you're gonna, that the horse is going to be consuming, will sort of dilute the water that's in the fresh pasture. So you're going to be at a better fiber sort of to water level in a way. And even if it's 50-50, or you put the horses out on the pasture for 2 or 3 hours a day, rather than just, locking them in that paddock 24/7, where you might end up having a few issues.
Yeah, 100%, Peter. There's no one size fits all with this. It's going to be looking at your whole pasture management and the way you manage your horse in and out, and to help lower that risk of colic and diarrhea by getting good digestible fibre into the diet when that dry matter is low in that fresh spring pasture.
I think it's up to the horse, obviously, and its digestive system to start adapting to the lush grass, because obviously it's not used to that coming from winter into spring. So doing it gradually, as I mentioned, a couple of hours a day, slowly, get adapted to it. It's going to be a much safer way of doing it than just throwing it out there and leaving it there and hoping for the best.
Yeah, 100%. And if you know your spring pasture is high in that NSC content, but you're still trying to balance the vitamin mineral profile going forward, because you're going to bring your horse in for competition or training, we do provide those two good options with the CF50 and the Sen grain free for the poor doer and the good doer. And you can be rest assured, because of its extremely low NSC, it's not going to really flare up any laminitis issues or metabolic problems going forward, and really complementary to that spring pasture.
That's well said. And if you've got a horse that obviously does sort of blow out during spring pasture or coming into the summertime, even if you're feeding the grain-free 20 kilogram product, it might be worthwhile to drop that horse back to obviously the CF50 at a much lower feed rate, say 200 to 250 grams. But you're still getting those vitamins, those minerals, the pro and prebiotics. So you don't need the extra calories as you have been throughout winter from the grain-free. Now, obviously, you're getting the extra calories from the pasture, but you still can't compromise on your vitamins and minerals. So maybe switching to that product for the next 3 or 4 months at a much lower feed rate, you're still going to be hitting those boxes that need to be ticked.
Yeah, and with the NSC issue in those spring pastures, when is the time to avoid it when it's at their highest? And it's those very early hours of the morning, and removing the horse at those times around the 2 to 3 hours after sunrise is going to lower that overall NSC intake, and then lower that potential risk of metabolic problems.
Yeah, well said, Brian. Look, some owners obviously put grazing muzzles on to restrict the intake. Look, we think it's a little bit sort of extreme. So I'd prefer maybe just tip that horse out for a couple of hours and then maybe stall it and make sure it's got a grassy hay sort of in front of its mouth 24/7. But the grazing muzzle to me is a little bit extreme, I think.
Yeah, I have to agree, Peter. We're trying to promote more naturalness for a horse, and it can lead to other temperament problems with frustration.
Stress. Yeah, cortisol increasing and, hormonal changes. And then, when you take that muzzle off, the horse is going to bolt for the hay, and, it's just a can of worms, I think.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. Yeah, so going back into the spookiness or the behaviour, looking at getting your pasture tested for their mineral content to see if the potassium is through the roof, and then see where your magnesium lies, and then balancing this up. So I think we did have a comment on the users group saying that our feed had a high potassium level per kg, but when you look at everything on the market, it's quite low. And
I think I might have put a cheeky comment in there, Brian, if, between us, sort of high gain and prides, if we have got the lowest potassium level, and obviously there's other companies sell a lot more feed than what we do. What I'm trying to say is that between us and the other two companies, every second horse in Australia would be head shaking because
if it was overloaded with potassium,
which it's not. And that's where I think, some people want to jump sort of to conclusions sometimes. Oh, this product's high in this or high in that. It's not one single product that's causing the problem. It's a combination of everything that you're feeding.
Yeah. The potassium levels in the grain-free would not have that impact that the pasture would, or the other elements of the feed. What is in there is what's naturally occurring. It's at a really safe level, and that's what we had to sort of enlighten. But it's not a dumb question by the user, because they're trying to learn on their end how nutrition is impacting the behavior of their horse. And it could not even be that. It could be a high protein intake. It could be other things NSC-wise, or other nutrients that are affecting that, but also the environment and the training. So they're a big puzzle, and we have to try and get those pieces together to see what exactly is the issue.
Just further on, Brian, onto that big puzzle that you mentioned, as a rule of thumb, the more feeds you feed from different companies, the harder it is to undo that puzzle, to know what's exactly causing the problem. Because if you're feeding 3 different feeds from 3 different companies, they've got 3 different vitamin and mineral mixes in those feeds. They've got different base raw ingredients, from mill run, say, to lupins, to oats, whatever it may be. So the more that you feed combined together from different companies, the harder it is to balance. So this is why we at Sen have a complete feed program, obviously based around hay or pasture, and we've got the vitamins, minerals to fill the gaps. We've got the omega-3 to fill the gaps, plus we've got some supplements as well. But it's easier to diagnose what a symptom is feeding one company's products, because then you can just go, okay, well, this is happening, I'm doing this, I'll take this out and see if it stops. But if you're feeding 3 feeds and you're getting head shaking, well, if you stop feeding the 3 feeds, then you're feeding nothing. So do you know what I'm saying? And if you go one by one, it's very difficult to pinpoint, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and it can be very time consuming. It can affect you mentally as
Frustrating
well.
as well.
And I think overall, you got to know where you stand. If you want to get to the bottom of that symptom, you need to get your pasture tested. You need to see exactly where you are and then adjust it, because roughage should be the foundation, either in pasture or a grassy hay that has been tested, to see where you can balance up those trace minerals and vitamins. Then you've got your base, and then you can move forward to see any other elements in the diet that need to be adjusted. Then looking at the horse itself, it could be sore, it could be telling you something behavior-wise as a result of something out structurally or physically.
Yeah, that's well said, Brian. And also, I think the people got to look for a pattern as well. Like if you've got a horse that you've had for 3 or 4 years, you're going to see a pattern there. Like what happens? Well, it gains weight or it loses weight. It starts getting irrational behavior at certain times of the year. So you got to look at a pattern and just see, well, is that a common pattern that happens every year? And someone's just freaking out. It might be harder if you get a new horse and you've got it for the first time, and you got that horse in the middle of winter, and it might have had some underlying issues, and now sort of spring grass comes and it starts, ballooning out of weight, or, starts getting inflammation in its feed, because obviously, there's a lot of sugar around. That I understand. So you're going to have to get a protocol, obviously, from now up until this time next year, and see the pattern. So it's important to, don't go out there just going, okay, well, it's one single thing. Look at exactly what you're feeding. Make sure that it's balanced. If it's balanced, then we got to look at the horse. Well, has it got underlying issues? Do we need to take something out? Do we need to bring something in? Does it need a supplement to help with digestion? Is it really just need to be stalled with the grassy hay that's really low in sugar and starch, and it might not be able to go on pasture up until maybe December, January. So as Brian sort of mentions regularly, every horse is different, and that one particular horse might need a different protocol to what some of the other horses in that same pack might be used to.
Yeah, I completely agree, Peter. And it's sometimes music to my ears on the phone when someone contacts us not being a Sen user, but then they know their horse inside out. They say they do react to this springtime. I know your products are 100% grain-free, no fillers, no unnecessary oils. And they say, I'm motivated to move to your product. I need the recommendation because this is not going to flare them up. And they know their horse from previous seasons. And as what Peter said, we've got to keep a diary and keep that monitor on your horse because they can be sensitive. And when you do have problems, having that track record, you can really adjust on the fly, and then you know exactly where you need to be in the next time it happens.
That's well said, Bryan. I think, as you said, you can adjust before it becomes a big problem, where I think if you leave it for too long and then you get into the big problem, it's very hard to undo, and then you're chasing your tail. You mentioned an example there, obviously, with the pasture being quite high in sugar. If you're feeding a complete feed that's high in sugar and starch on top of the 20-30% sugar in spring grass, that's a recipe for disaster. And where our product comes in, we're only 2.9% sugar and starch. So if you are obviously, or if your horse is out there on spring pasture at 30% sugar, with our product being 2.9%, you're balancing out that high sugar, where if you're feeding another company's feed that might be 25% sugar and starch on top of the 30% sugar in your pasture, I mean, that's more than half your diet with sugar and starch. And if you've got a horse that's got any underlying issues, that horse will have problems.
Yeah, especially burning those calories, being on the limiter in terms of their metabolic processing. And we know they're designed physiology-wise to ferment fibre day in, day out, and that should be their main source of energy and calorie input.
1.2, Bryan, I'd like to make is that for owners, don't be shy to exercise the horse even a little bit more sort of this time of the year, because obviously there's a lot more sugar in that pasture, so that they're going to have a lot more energy. So it's probably wise to do a lot more exercise rather than let that sugar sort of build up in them. Obviously they'll get obese, they'll put weight on. There's more weight for the legs to carry. There's possible inflammation there as well. So I think exercise is paramount to burning off those extra calories, and obviously you're going to get the fitness, you're going to get the top line, hopefully, that you desire.
Yeah, 100%, Peter. This wraps this subject up, I think.
Bryan, and I hope the take-home message for the listeners out there is, like, we're not trying to scare people. Obviously don't put your horse out on pasture. It's more for you to be aware of. Obviously, there are issues with the high sugar level, and look, that high sugar is not going to be there for 12 months. But the drastic change from obviously winter into spring is the worst. A product like the Extra Balance is ideally for change of seasons, because obviously there's more sugar in a diet. So we recommend just doing a flush every quarter to stabilize that gut microbiome. Obviously, there's a bit of stress going on. There's a lot more sugar in a diet. There's change happening. So just as a precautionary thing for every change of season, if you just do one bucket of the Sen Extra Balance, that'll help stabilize all that gut microbiome there to make that transition a lot easier.
Yeah, it's a really good protocol, and a lot of horse owners use it when they change their feed or make drastic adjustments. And when the pastures come through different seasons, that is like changing the feed, and you need that microbiome support, as Peter said.
It's more, Bryan, like an insurance policy that, nothing might go wrong. But the thing is, if something does go wrong, your vet bills are going to be, a lot higher than a gut product for sort of $70. So.
Yeah, no, 100%. So we've been in a pretty busy period at the moment launching this new Sen lupin pellet. Yeah,
very, very good inquiry, and sort of people can't wait to get it into their hands. And as we mentioned in a previous podcast, we think it's a groundbreaking product. It's a game changer, and the profile we've managed to achieve with the balanced zinc, the copper, the iron, the manganese, but also having a lupin that's high in fibre. It's I think it's going to be a product for all sorts of horse. Whether you're a performance horse, you don't need the extra grain. You can supplement some of the grain with the high fibre lupin. Some horses need the high fibre. They don't need too much protein. So it's a product for every horse. Obviously, you just got to feed the right amount for your discipline and your work that you're doing.
And it's 100% Aussie.
Not imported like a lot of those other byproducts from Europe and Asia that are on the market. And I think the longer the COVID thing goes on, obviously there's supply chain issues. It's actually costing us a lot more money to export our products as well, because obviously there's the same supply chains issues coming into Australia as there is going out of Australia. So it's pretty paramount that I think a lot of people support locally made products, not just our products, but when you do your shopping, look for that Made in Australia symbol, because remember, all the textiles stay in Australia, and the whole country basically rebuilds, and let's get the economy going again.
Yeah, I think we're all opening up soon, so yeah, hopefully times can return to normal.
Let's hope.
We won't go down that rabbit hole, Peter.
No. Well, I think that about wraps it up, Brian.
Yeah, okay, we'll wrap this. And you guys know how to get us on the usual channels through our Send HQ number, the Send users group, and also social media, or like Instagram. We passed 5,000 followers.
I think we're up to close to 17,000 listens for the podcast as well.
Yeah, it's been really good, and the feedback, we really appreciate everyone's feedback, and yeah, we're just grateful to have everyone's support.
And the loyalty too. We find a lot of the same, obviously, users, once they use the products for a first time, they're very loyal to us, and they stay on the feed. And we've done a podcast on this. Is Send really expensive? When you calculate how much of our products you feed in terms of the volume per day, it does work out a lot cheaper than if you're feeding 3 or 4 different products at 2 or 3 different kilo feed rates. So that's where Carly comes in. Obviously, she's got to balance your diet, make sure that you're not overdoing something and not underdoing it. And it's even more important, as I said previously, to do your free diet analysis. Obviously, spring pastures around. We've just done a podcast on it. You might not need as many calories, in October, November as what you would in sort of June or July. So, you could even feed less than what you might obviously in other months, which will bring your cost of feed down as well. So, and I'm sure there are people out there that feed the same way, throughout the whole year, which is not really the best thing to be doing.
Yeah, no, that's well said, Peter. It's that attention to detail with horse ownership, not just nutrition-wise, but training and the way their environment is, that's really paramount for them to thrive in that domesticated environment.
And just one last note, me and Brian are always available to take phone calls in the office as well. We've got Carly there. We're pretty good on all the socials as well. So as we said before, there's no dumb question. And we look forward to launching this loop and pellet product later this week, and appreciate everyone's support.
Yeah, I think it's time for lunch, Peter.
Let's end it there, Brian.
Yeah. All right, see you guys.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Yes, yeah.